Hello and welcome to our lecture on conflict analysis and mapping. So we are moving this week more into the practical side of conflict analysis and resolution, and we'll look at some models that we use in the field to analyze and map conflicts. So let's first just repeat and remember our principles, conflict analysis resolution principles, that conflict studies, or our field is sometimes called conflict and peace studies field, deals primarily with analysis and resolution. So in the first part of the class, we have talked about theories and concepts of conflict resolution, and now we are moving into the analysis. Our field, as we know, is interdisciplinary, which means that we draw knowledge from different disciplines because conflicts are complex phenomena, and in order to understand them, we need to use different disciplines from social psychology, international relations, development, cultural studies, mathematics, philosophy, sociology, and other disciplines. Our field promotes critical thinking about social relationship, needs, aspirations, and power relations between individuals and groups. Conflict is not necessarily bad, right? It can lead to the challenging of status quo, and if it's not destructive but constructive, conflict can bring about positive change, right? And examples of constructive conflicts we have mentioned, these are some nonviolent strategies, nonviolent protests, diplomacy, negotiation, problem-solving workshops. All of these are ways to deal with conflicts constructively. Violence is a negative manifestation of conflict, and we mentioned when the violence occurs, then we have direct conflict, direct violence, and we need to do everything that's in our power in order to prevent violence from erupting, because dealing with consequences of violence is very difficult, and because it leaves a trail of destruction, not only physical destruction, but also emotional and relational kind of destruction, which takes decades and ages to address. Cooperation is an inherent opportunity always in conflict. So that's something that we believe. So we believe as conflict resolution practitioners that we can move a conflict from competition, aggression, coercion towards cooperation. How? Through negotiation, through dialogue, through diplomacy, through preventative measures, through sanctions, and so on. So there are different ways of how we can bring about cooperation in conflict. So another important point to remember is that conflict analysis and resolution field is a combination of theory, research, and practice. It's only partly theoretical field. I would say that it's more of a practical field, right? So we are dealing with real life situations, real life problems, and we are trying to find the best way to address it. And we cannot address conflicts only through theoretical means or only through analysis. Okay, we need to understand conflict, and that's where analysis and mapping and theoretical concepts help us. But since conflict is a phenomenon that's constantly changing, we need a constant feedback from the ground through practice, through intervention, through research, right? So theory, research, and practice always feed into each other in conflict resolution field, and they are all equally important. So in this lecture, we will talk more about conflict analysis. What is conflict analysis? And how do we do conflict analysis? Conflict analysis is more narrowly focused on specific elements of that broader picture that may trigger or propel conflict. And what's important about analysis is that it has to be updated constantly because conflicts are constantly changing. They're changing the nature, and we even have the emergence of new conflicts. So you didn't have this, for example, cyber war type of conflict 100 years ago. So the conflict has changed tremendously. Now we have these distance conflict where you have the use of drones and so on, spying and so on. So this is something that did not exist 100, 200 years ago. And conflicts will continue to change as the societies change. So, and even conflicts, that are ongoing, they are changing. You remember that curve, the conflict curve, that is a linear representation of conflict stages. But conflicts are more complex. That is just for you to see, an ideal model of conflict. But conflicts change in real life very often. So even if we, let's say, if the parties, for example, sign an agreement, there might be a new escalation of conflict. So we should be aware of that. And when we do analysis, you cannot do it without having people on the ground. So the ones that are actually practitioners that are doing the job on the ground, the researchers and so on. So here in conflict analysis, you have this connectivity of theory, practice, and research. Also, good analysis may not guarantee effectiveness, given that there are many factors that cannot be controlled, that can go wrong for some reason. So we can try and do the best conflict analysis possible, but we still have to be aware that we might not be correct and that we might have missed some factor. Okay. So what do we look in conflict analysis? We're looking at the driving factors of conflict, issues, parties, causes, effects, outcomes of conflict, relationship dynamics among factors, who is supporting conflicts, who are what they say, positive and negative attractors of conflict, who are the key actors, what are the linkages? Just remember Azar. What are the linkages of conflict to some international actors and conditions, and so on. So, what were the interventions that were already done, and what can be done in the future? So all of that can be looked at and examined when we analyze conflict. So here is one example of conflict analysis. So this is presented on the slide, but there are many other models that can help us do conflict analysis. So here you see we have a table that tells us which forces are for peace and which are against peace. So what is contributing to peace and what is challenging peace. Who are the key actors? So that's one of the ways to do it. Let's now see what are the other types that are used in conflict resolution field. What are other types of analysis? And for conflict analysis, we like to use the mapping or these visual representations of conflict, right? The 4 types of tools commonly used to do the mapping, the analysis of conflict, is Paul Ware's model, Mary Dugan's nested model, Christopher Mitchell's Spitzer model, and Dennis Sandole's 3 pillars model. There are, of course, other models, as I said, and like organizations such as USAID or Amnesty International or Greenpeace. All of these organizations have their own models. World Bank, they all have their own models of conflict analysis, because when, for example, these big organizations, big or small, even the NGOs, when they go in some area, let's say conflict affected area, one of the important things that they need to do first is to make sure they understand the conditions and situation there and to analyze conflict, right? What is happening? Who are the actors? Who is feeding the conflict? Who is challenging the peace, and so on? So these kinds of assessments are done for any type of programming. So if you, for example, get a job with USAID, and you are involved in some, let's say, sustainable development project, say you're building a hospital somewhere, you will have to do, as a program officer, you will have to do the conflict analysis of that particular area, okay? And this will have to be updated constantly. Okay, so what is the purpose of this conflict resolution mapping? It shows a structure of conflict, the basic elements that permits us to produce a roadmap to understand and look for the right intervention. So, and also it makes us think of like a contingency plan. So what if there is a good possibility that, let's say, riots might happen in the case of elections, and the elections are coming up in 2 years. So what kind of a plan, contingency plan, do we have to address a possible violence so that it doesn't affect our program in a bad way, right? So this is why we do conflict analysis and mapping. It's usually easy to visualize, so the point is to create like this map of actors or issues or other elements, and then create some kind of a connections between them, and you will see how this can be done. And this gives us this initial understanding of the conditions on the ground. It's not the ending point, as I said, it needs constant updating. Okay, so here we have Spitzer, and this is a model that was developed by Chris Mitchell, and basically these are the questions that should guide the analysis that he thought of and used in his practice. So it's quite useful, and I'll probably ask you to do this in your class, to do a conflict analysis using one of these frameworks. And you can, of course, do this in your free time, or you can do it also as part of the blog that you are submitting this week. But anyway, this is a very interesting part of conflict analysis resolution field. you're really, looking into the details of the conflict and why you're doing the research, right? So, you will read, so what are the origins, sources of conflict, P is the parties, I is issues, T is tactics, C changes in conflict, E is enlargement of conflict, and so on. So you will check this out. And here we have also a very interesting model that's used for conflict mapping. It's a nested model of conflict, and it was created by Mayer Dugan. So, as you can see, what's interesting about this model is that it has these circles, so that you have like an issue in the middle, which means that conflicts are usually, no matter how small they are embedded in bigger issues, or they are fed directly or indirectly by certain, let's say, institutional, structural, relational dynamics. So it's very interesting that it's embedded, right? It's an embedded conflict. Let's say conflict around a specific issue. Let's pick one conflict so that you will see how this one conflict that just by looking at it is a very simple conflict. But how can it be embedded in a much more serious issues than what we see at first glance? So let's see, specific issue. Let's say roommates. One roommate is irritated by the music of the other, or let's say two neighbors are irritated by the noise. So one neighbor is playing music and the other is irritated. He or she likes peace. Okay, so this is a conflict around noise. It's a very common conflict, right? We think, oh, it's a simple conflict. Okay, so let's see at the relational part of this conflict. What's the relational? Well, patterns. We need to look at patterns of interaction. What are the patterns of interaction? Are there any relational problems between these neighbors? They might have, for example, different identities or affiliations which prevent them, for example, to interact with each other and resolve conflict. Their relationship is strained, they avoid each other, they are maybe in such a context that for example, let's say they're of different identity background and they are not used to communicate very well. They hardly say hello to each other. So that makes this conflict now a little bit more complex. It's not only about noise, right? And then we go into the next level, which is the structural level. Let's say, and subsystem and system structural level. Structural level, there is some inequity in the structure. So noise may be due to the, let's say, bad insulation in a building, but this points that these people, these two neighbors, are living in some poor area, where the buildings are badly built and they can hear the noise. And this again, the poverty and not being able to pay for to rent an apartment in a nicer building where you will not hear the noise. This points to some kind of a structural violence. Well, poverty is a form of structural violence. And it can be even taken to the systemic level, which is, okay, so what's going on in, let's say, international system, and why this particular society, why large proportions of these populations are living in poverty and in these cramped buildings, badly insulated buildings. Okay, so this is just an example how you can analyze conflict that at first glance is very simple, but it's not really. It's embedded in much larger issues. Okay, and then we have Dennis Sandole's three-pillar model. Again, he puts under each pillar what to look at. So pillar 2 there talks about conflict conditions, pillar 1 about conflict sources, and pillar 3 about intervention, conflict resolution kind of things. So again, you can practice and use this model on a particular conflict to analyze a particular conflict. Here, just this is the difference between these different kinds of resolution strategies, different kinds of conflict interventions, conflict prevention, conflict management, settlement, resolution, transformation, and prevention. Prevention is an interesting term. So prevention is like an early intervention to prevent conflict from escalating through diplomacy, through negotiation. John Burton talks about prevention. He was the first one to use this term, which means that we need to be proactive in preventing conflict from happening. It's not only about prevention, but we need to be creative and proactive in preventing the conflict. And here we have again this famous conflict curve, which is, like as I said, the ideal model that shows the stages of conflict from prevention to conflict transformation. But you already know this model, so I will not go into it deeply. Okay, and now here we have an example of conflict mapping. Conflict mapping. So we have a particular case, refugees, and as you can see, there are the different parties that are involved. So this one focuses in particular on different parties and how do they relate to the main party in question that is under siege, which are refugees. What's interesting is these different, so you have a little table index where it shows what kind of relations exist between different kind of parties. So you have alliances, you have informal relation, you have conflict, like between government of China and refugees, and so on. So this is one example of how we can do the mapping, just to understand the parties, okay? Here is another conflict mapping example. Again, you have the index, which shows you the relationship between parties, and you can have also relationships between different issues, different results, outcomes, and so on. Another case, see here you have the roles, not just the parties, but the roles of the parties. So think about these questions. What did we learn today? Why is conflict analysis and mapping important? And try some of these models on a specific conflict and see what seems better to you, what tools work better for the type of conflict that you have chosen. And remember, it's never finished. The analysis of conflict is never finished. It constantly needs to be updated. And who knows, maybe you will think of some new mapping method and new conflict analysis method, because as I said, as conflict is changing, as the nature of conflict is changing, we need new tools to understand it and to map it. Okay, so please do the readings, and I look forward to reading your blogs. And in the discussion sessions, I hope you will do some of the mapping. I look forward to your feedback about mapping and conflict analysis, and Thank you for listening and have a great week.